The needle punched through thick flesh with a wet, heavy crunch. Elara pulled the thick black thread tight, her bare hands slick with fresh blood. The freezing wind battered the canvas walls of the infirmary tent, but she didn't shiver from the cold. She shivered because every time she shifted her weight, a white-hot spike of pure agony drove straight up her right leg. The shattered bone in her femur ground together. She bit down hard on the inside of her cheek. The bitter, ashy taste of the death root flooded her tongue. She kept a small piece of the highly toxic bark tucked into the back of her mouth at all times. It was slowly poisoning her blood. She knew that. But as the dark numbness crept down her throat and settled over the infected, rotting bone in her leg, the blinding pain finally dulled to a sickening throb. It was the only way she could remain standing. "You're pulling too tight." The Vanguard warrior on the steel table hissed through his teeth. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the canvas ceiling, annoyed. "Watch your hands, half-breed. You're ruining the tattoo." Elara didn't apologize. She just tied off the heavy knot and snipped the excess thread with her surgical shears. "Keep the wound clean," she murmured, her voice raspy and hollow. "The frostbite will set in before morning if you don't keep the bandages dry." "Just wrap it," the warrior snapped. "I have first watch in an hour. Some of us actually work to earn our keep." As the silence stretched, Elara reached for the roll of linen. She dragged her bad leg behind her. It felt heavy. Useless. The infection was spreading, painting the skin beneath her heavy wool trousers an angry, feverish purple. She could smell the faint, sour stench of her own decaying tissue beneath the sharp medicinal tang of the tent. No one else seemed to notice. Or, if they did, they simply didn't care. She was just the pack healer, a piece of Vanguard property. She leaned against the edge of the steel table to take the weight off her femur. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the freezing draft. She just needed him to leave. She needed 5 minutes to sit in the dark and let the death root do its work. Without warning, the heavy canvas flap of the tent was violently ripped back. A blast of freezing snow swirled into the dim lantern light, followed by the heavy, measured crunch of boots. Elara froze. The needle slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the metal tray. She didn't need to look up to know who had just walked in. She knew the scent of expensive pine soap and arrogance. Dorian. The Alpha's son stepped fully into the infirmary, brushing a light dusting of snow from his pristine fur mantle. He looked entirely out of place amidst the blood-soaked rags and groaning wounded. Well, Dorian's voice was a low, smooth purr that made the hairs on Elara's arms stand up. "Still standing, little bird? I must say, I'm impressed." Elara kept her eyes locked on the linen bandages in her hands. She forced her breathing to remain slow and even. She swallowed another drop of the toxic root's juices, begging the numbness to hold. "I have patience, Dorian," she said. Dorian chuckled. He closed the distance between them lazily, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. "You do, and they look so very grateful for your delicate touch." He stopped right beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The sheer physical presence of the Alpha's son radiating power was enough to make the wounded warrior on the table suddenly look away, pretending to be utterly fascinated by the opposite wall. The other 2 injured wolves in the far cots squeezed their eyes shut. Complete, systemic silence. They were collective cowards. Every single one of them knew exactly how Elara's leg had been shattered. They knew Dorian had cornered her in the woods 3 weeks ago. They knew she had refused him. And they knew what he had done to her in retaliation. Yet, here they were, actively turning a blind eye while she bled for them. "You're limping," Dorian observed, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. He leaned down, his mouth hovering just inches from her ear. "I told you to come to my quarters, Elara. I told you I could have the pack doctors look at that nasty break. All you had to do was ask nicely. I would rather rot." "Oh, you are," he whispered, his eyes flicking down to her swollen thigh. "I can smell it. It's only a matter of time before that infection hits your heart. Then what use will you be to my father's pack?" He raised a gloved hand, reaching for the heavy wool of her coat. Her body moved on instinct. Elara flinched backward, bumping hard against the surgical table. The sudden shift in weight transferred directly to her shattered femur. A jagged spike of pure agony tore through the numb haze of the root. She gasped, her vision going completely white for a terrified second. She gripped the edge of the steel table so hard her knuckles popped. Dorian smiled, a slow, cruel stretching of his lips. "Careful now, we wouldn't want you to fall." He stepped closer, backing her against the cold steel. The warrior on the table slid off the opposite side and quietly limped out of the tent, completely abandoning her. "You're going to beg me," Dorian murmured. "By the end of the week, you'll be crawling to my door." A distant, blaring horn shattered the night. The sound was instantly cut short by a wet, heavy tearing noise. Then, a scream. The tension broke. Dorian spun toward the tent entrance, his cruel smile vanishing. The arrogant posture of the Alpha's son evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed panic, as a chorus of brutal, blood-curdling howls echoed through the blizzard outside. It wasn't a standard patrol clash. It was an absolute slaughter. Heavy thuds shook the frozen earth. The sound of tearing flesh and snapping bones drowned out the howling wind. Shadows violently clashed against the thin, illuminated canvas of the infirmary tent. Blood sprayed in thick, dark arcs against the fabric, painting horrifying silhouettes from the outside in. "Rogues," Dorian gasped, drawing the silver blade at his hip. "The Vanguard perimeter is breached." Before he could finish the sentence, the entire front wall of the infirmary tent was ripped away. The freezing storm violently rushed in, blowing out half the lanterns. Standing in the shredded wreckage of the entrance was a nightmare. He was massive, covered head to toe in the blood of Vanguard warriors. His dark hair was wild, plastered to his forehead with melting snow and gore. He held a jagged, terrifyingly heavy broadsword in one hand, completely at ease with the weight of it. Kaelen, the feral king. Dorian didn't even try to fight. The Alpha's son dropped his sword and bolted for the rear exit of the tent, shoving past the remaining wounded and leaving Elara entirely exposed. Kaelen didn't chase him. He stepped into the tent, his predatory gaze sweeping the room. He moved toward the medical supplies stacked behind Elara. He slaughtered 2 injured Vanguard warriors who tried to stand, his blade moving with clinical, terrifying silence. He didn't roar, he didn't boast, he just killed them. Then, his icy, pale eyes locked onto Elara. She stood frozen against the bloody surgical table. There was nowhere to run. Her leg wouldn't carry her 2 steps. This was it. The feral enemy was going to finish what Dorian had started. Between one breath and the next, Kaelen lunged. Elara didn't scream. She just closed her eyes and tilted her head up, exposing her throat. She welcomed the dark. She welcomed the end of the pain. The heavy rush of air hit her face as the broadsword swung down. Then, nothing. Elara slowly opened her eyes. The blade had stopped less than an inch from her collarbone. Kaelen was towering over her. He wasn't looking at her face. He was staring down at her chest, his chest heaving violently. He leaned in, his nose brushing the collar of her blood-stained coat. He inhaled, a deep, shuddering drag of air. His nostrils flared. His pupils swallowed his irises, turning his eyes entirely black. Through the overwhelming stench of copper blood, freezing rain, and sharp medicinal alcohol, his inner beast had found something impossible. He smelled the rotting, infected bone. He smelled the bitter, toxic ash of the death root on her breath. And underneath it all, he smelled his mate. The heavy broadsword hit the blood-soaked floorboards with a deafening crash. Elara flinched, her eyes flying open. She expected to see her own blood pooling on the wood. Instead, Kaelen's hands were already on her. He didn't speak. He didn't gloat. Between one breath and the next, the world violently flipped upside down. A startled gasp tore from her throat as Kaelen hoisted her effortlessly over his massive, leather-clad shoulder. The sheer force of his movement knocked the remaining breath from her lungs. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. This was it. She was a prize of war. The feral blood enemy was taking her back to the rogue camp to be tortured, or worse, to be made an example of. "Let me go!" She hammered her fists against the thick muscles of his back. He ignored her entirely. Kaelen pivoted, his boots crushing the discarded surgical tray, and stormed back out into the raging blizzard. The freezing wind hit Elara like a physical blow. The sounds of the slaughter were deafening now, the screams of Vanguard warriors, the tearing of tents, the guttural roars of the rogue wolves claiming their victory. Kaelen carved a path straight through the chaos. A Vanguard guard lunged out of the snow, spear raised. Kaelen didn't even break his stride. He simply threw out his free hand, catching the guard by the throat and snapping his neck with a sickening crunch. Elara squeezed her eyes shut. She thrashed against his grip, kicking out with her good leg. "Put me down! Stop moving!" His voice was a deep, chest-rattling rumble that vibrated straight through her ribs. She didn't stop. She kicked harder, desperate to slip from his grasp. But as she twisted, her shattered right leg swung freely in the air. The heavy, jarring motion pulled the broken bone directly against the inflamed tissue. The toxic death root could only do so much. The numb haze snapped. A scream of pure, unadulterated agony ripped past her lips. Her vision exploded into blinding white stars. The pain was absolute, washing over her in a suffocating wave that drowned out the howling wind and the clash of steel. Her fingers dug weakly into Kaelen's bloody coat as her body went completely limp. The freezing storm swallowed her as she slipped entirely into the dark. Elara drifted in a hazy, agonizing twilight. She wasn't dead. She knew that, because the dead didn't feel the nauseating throb of an infected femur. But the world around her was a blur of motion and extreme temperatures. The biting wind lashed at her exposed face, threatening to freeze her eyelashes solid. Yet, the body beneath her was a raging furnace. She was still draped over Kaelen's shoulder. They had been moving for hours. The sounds of the Vanguard encampment were long gone, replaced by the eerie, hollow whistle of wind tearing through high mountain passes. She tried to lift her head. It was too heavy. As the silence stretched, she became acutely aware of his hands. Kaelen's left arm was wrapped firmly around her waist, securing her against his chest. But his right hand was gripping her thigh, just inches above the shatter point of her femur. He wasn't grabbing her like a prisoner, he was bracing the leg. Every time he leaped over a snowdrift or descended a steep, icy ridge, his massive hand locked down, absorbing the shock so the broken bone wouldn't shift. Why? The cognitive dissonance made her dizzy. He was the feral king, the monster her pack told campfire stories about. He had just slaughtered half her camp. So why was he radiating his alpha body heat directly into her shivering frame? Why was he protecting the very leg her own pack had ignored? "Quiet now," he murmured. Not to her, to the wolves running beside them. The wind suddenly cut out. The echo of heavy boots changed from crunching snow to wet, solid stone. Elara forced her heavy eyelids open. They were deep underground. Torches flickered against damp, jagged rock walls. The rogue ice caves. Kaelen stopped moving. He shifted his grip, carefully lowering her from his shoulder. He didn't drop her. He guided her down until her back hit a thick, surprisingly soft bed of furs. He stood over her for a long second. The flickering torchlight cast heavy shadows across his blood-streaked face. His chest rose and fell in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. He looked at her broken leg, then back up to her pale, sweaty face. He didn't say a word. He turned on his heel and walked out. A heavy iron grate slammed shut. The grinding echo of a massive lock tumbling into place shook the stone walls. Elara was entirely alone. The silence of the cell was heavier than the freezing wind outside. For a full minute, she just lay on the furs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Then, her survival instinct kicked in. She couldn't rest. Resting meant waiting for the enemy to decide her fate. Resting meant relying on the strange, confusing gentleness of a monster who could snap her neck at any moment. She gritted her teeth and rolled onto her stomach. The agony in her leg was blinding, but she dragged herself off the furs anyway. She dug her fingernails into the damp stone floor, pulling her heavy, useless limb behind her. She crawled to the iron grate. Thick, rust-covered bars, solid stone hinges, no weak points, no guard stationed outside. She panted, her breath blooming in small white clouds in the freezing air. She turned her head, scanning the dim confines of her new cage. It was large, larger than her tent at the Vanguard camp. In the far corner, a small subterranean spring trickled down the rock face, pooling into a shallow basin. Thirst clawed at her throat. She dragged herself across the uneven floor, every inch a battle against the rising tide of septic fever. When she finally reached the small pool, she collapsed against the stone rim. She cupped her shaking, blood-stained hands and drank. The water was icy and tasted faintly of iron and earth. It cleared her head, just enough to let her eyes focus on the damp rocks surrounding the spring. There, clinging to the shadows where the moisture gathered, grew a cluster of pale, fleshy caps. Elara froze. Her breath hitched. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the gills of the small fungus. Death caps. Highly toxic. When dried and ground with hearth ash, they created a powder that, if inhaled, instantly paralyzed the respiratory system. It was a poison forbidden by healer law. A poison that could drop a fully grown alpha in seconds. Without warning, a cold, clinical calm washed over her. She looked down at her swollen, dying leg. Then she looked back at the iron bars. Dorian had broken her. The Vanguard had abandoned her. Now, the Rogue King had caged her. She reached into her coat, pulling out a small, empty linen pouch she used for bandages. Very carefully, she began to harvest the lethal mushrooms. She wasn't going to be a victim anymore. She was going to kill her way out. The rough stones scraped against the hollowed-out rock with a sickening, rhythmic grit. Grind, scrape, grind. Elara knelt by the cold, dead fire pit at the center of her cell. 3 days had bled into one long, feverish nightmare since her abduction. Her hands shook violently as she worked, crushing the pale, fleshy death caps into the ancient hearth ash. She was dying. The toxic root was fully out of her system now. Without its numbing shield, the infection in her shattered femur was raging. The skin of her thigh was hot to the touch, swollen against the fabric of her trousers. Every heartbeat pumped a fresh wave of septic venom through her veins. Her vision swam with gray spots. But her mind was terrifyingly clear. She poured the fine, grayish powder into a scrap of linen torn from her sleeve. She folded the edges tight, creating a small, concentrated explosive packet of paralytic dust. It was enough to drop a bear. She tucked the lethal pouch securely into the bandages wrapping her thigh. A heavy, suffocating wave of guilt threatened to rise in her chest. Healers did not kill. They swore an oath to preserve life. She crushed the guilt instantly. The Vanguard had used her oath to enslave her. Dorian had used it to torture her. She would not let the Rogue King use it to break her. As the silence stretched, the ambient noise of the cavern changed. The distant echo of dripping water stopped. The very air pressure in the damp stone cell seemed to plummet, pressing heavily against her eardrums. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and entirely silent against the stone. Without warning, the heavy iron grate swung open. Kaelen stepped out of the shadows and fully into the flickering torchlight. He held a wooden plate piled high with roasted venison. The rich, salty smell of the hot meat flooded the damp cell, making Elara's empty stomach cramp violently. Kaelen didn't step toward her. He closed the iron grate behind him, locking it. Then he moved to the far wall and sat down on a jagged outcropping of rock. He placed the plate on the floor halfway between them. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his massive knees. He just watched her. Elara pushed herself back against the icy wall, her hand instinctively hovering near the hidden powder in her bandages. She expected commands. She expected threats. She expected him to demand the names of Vanguard patrols. "Who shattered your femur?" His voice was a low, rumbling bass. It didn't echo. It filled the room, soaking into the stone. Elara's jaw locked. She stared at the steaming meat, then glared up at the feral king. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. "Go to hell." Kaelen didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He just let the silence stretch out, heavy and suffocating. A weaponized pause that made her skin crawl. "The break is 3 weeks old," Kaelen said softly. "The bone was deliberately crushed, not sliced, not bitten, crushed. Who did it?" Her chest heaved. The audacity of this monster, playing the concerned captor when he had slaughtered her camp. Elara lunged forward, her good leg pushing off the stone. She grabbed the wooden plate and hurled it with all her fading strength directly at his boots. The meat scattered across the dirty floor. The heavy wooden plate clattered loudly in the quiet cell. Elara threw her arms over her face and braced for the blow. She waited for the backhand. She waited for the explosive alpha rage. She waited for him to grab her by the throat. The tension broke. Nothing happened. Slowly, Elara lowered her arms. Kaelen hadn't moved a muscle. He was looking down at the ruined food, his expression completely unreadable. Between one breath and the next, he stood up. He calmly bent down, gathered the pieces of meat, and placed them back on the plate. He walked to the bars, unlocked the grate, and stepped outside. He paused, looking back through the iron at her trembling, swollen leg. "You're dying," he murmured, the words barely a whisper over the freezing draft. Then he walked away. Elara dragged herself to the iron bars, her hands gripping the rusted metal to keep from collapsing. Through the narrow corridor, she had a clear view of the cavernous main chamber. Dozens of rogue wolves moved through the massive underground space. She watched them with fever-bright eyes, looking for the chaos she had always been taught to expect. It wasn't there. There was no infighting over scraps of meat. There was no boastful roaring, no sadistic games like Dorian played with the Vanguard trainees. The rogue warriors moved with silent, lethal military discipline. Weapons were systematically sharpened and catalogued. Rations were divided equally among the wounded and the strong. Even the way they spoke to each other, in low, respectful murmurs, shattered every story the Vanguard had ever told her. They weren't feral beasts. They were an exiled army. A profound, sickening realization twisted in Elara's gut. The Vanguard had lied. Her entire life, her enslavement, her torment at Dorian's hands, it was all built on a foundation of systemic corruption. The monsters weren't the ones living in the ice caves. The monsters were the ones who had forced her to stitch them up. A sudden, violent tremor racked her frame. Her knees buckled. Elara hit the stone floor hard, her teeth clicking together. The cavern spun in sickening circles. The heat radiating from her thigh was no longer just a fever. It was a raging, localized fire. Her vision blurred, the edges of the iron bars turning fuzzy and gray. Sepsis. It was flooding her bloodstream. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. She was running out of time. If she didn't get out of this cave and find the frozen willow bark growing on the mountain ridges, her organs would begin to shut down by morning. Her body moved on pure, desperate instinct. She pulled the small linen packet of death cap powder from her bandages. Her fingers were numb, but she gripped it like a lifeline. She couldn't wait for Kaelen to return. She would have to lure the corridor guard to the bars. Tonight. It had to be tonight. The fire in her veins turned to actual, crawling ice. Elara convulsed violently against the damp stone floor. The withdrawal from the toxic root hit her nervous system like a sledgehammer. Without the chemical numbing her brain, every single nerve ending in her body screamed in unison. The septic fever raged, turning the freezing air of the cavern into a suffocating, unbearable heat. She squeezed her eyes shut, clawing at her own throat. "You'll crawl to my door," Elara whimpered. Dorian's voice was right next to her ear, smooth, mocking. She thrashed onto her side, striking the empty air. "Just ask nicely, little bird." "No," she rasped, her voice cracking. "Get away from me." She could smell the expensive pine soap. She could feel the phantom pressure of his heavy boots trapping her against the surgical table. The hallucinations were so vivid, they stole the breath straight from her lungs. She dragged her fingernails across the jagged stone, desperate to anchor herself to reality, but the phantom hands were already grabbing at her clothes. She kicked out frantically, her shattered femur grinding together. The pain was so sharp she tasted blood. She had bitten completely through her lower lip. As the silence stretched, the phantom smell of pine soap was suddenly cut by the sharp, earthy scent of damp leather and old iron. Elara's eyes snapped open. The hallucination shattered. Through her blurred, feverish vision, a heavy shadow loomed on the other side of the iron grate. It wasn't Dorian. It was one of the rogue guards. He was gripping the bars, staring down at her with wide, unsettled eyes as she violently shook on the floor. She needed to get out. The infection was eating her brain. Her hand twitched, sliding agonizingly slow toward the swollen bandages wrapped around her thigh. Her frozen fingers found the small, coarse linen packet tucked against her skin. The death cap powder. The heavy lock on the grate gave a metallic groan. The guard turned the heavy iron key. The grate swung inward with a low, grating screech. Elara didn't hesitate. She threw her head back against the stone and let her body violently seize. She arched her spine, locking her limbs in a rigid, terrifying spasm. It wasn't entirely an act. The fever was already wreaking havoc on her muscles, but she weaponized the tremor, letting out a breathless, choking sound. The guard rushed into the cell. "Hey, stop moving!" He dropped to his knees beside her, his large hands reaching out to pin her flailing shoulders to the stone. Her body moved on instinct. The moment his hands touched her coat, the seizing stopped. Elara's eyes snapped into focus, cold and completely lucid. Between one breath and the next, her hand whipped out from beneath her cloak. She crushed the linen packet in her fist, bringing it squarely toward the guard's face. All she had to do was blow the gray dust directly into his eyes and mouth. His lungs would paralyze in seconds. He would choke on empty air, and she would take his knife. Her lungs expanded to blow. Without warning, a massive hand clamped over her wrist with blinding, bone-crushing speed. The force of the grip halted her arm entirely. The guard flinched backward, stumbling over his own boots in shock. Elara choked on her breath. She looked up, her heart stopping cold in her chest. Kaelen stood over her. He had moved so fast he didn't even displace the air. His massive fingers completely engulfed her trembling wrist, trapping the exposed, crushed powder inside her palm. "Get out!" Kaelen didn't yell. The command was dangerously soft. The guard didn't ask questions. He scrambled off the floor and bolted out of the cell, leaving the iron grate hanging wide open. Elara stared up at the Feral King, her pulse roaring in her ears. He caught her. The execution was coming. She braced for the crushing blow, her muscles tensing in anticipation of her bones snapping under his immense strength. The tension broke. Kaelen didn't strike her. Instead, he slowly dropped to one knee, bringing his face level with hers. He kept his iron grip on her wrist, forcing her hand open. The fine gray dust sat perfectly piled in the center of her trembling palm. Kaelen leaned in. He didn't flinch away from the lethal substance. He lowered his face until his nose was an inch from her hand. He inhaled deeply, his dark eyes analyzing the scent. "Deathcap mushroom," he murmured, "mixed with hearth ash, an aerosol paralytic." He looked up from her palm. His pale, icy eyes locked onto hers. There was no anger. There was no alpha dominance punishing her for trying to kill his men. Instead, the expression on his face made the breath catch in her throat. It was awe. Raw, obsessive awe. "You ground this in the dark," he said, his voice a low, heavy rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. "While dying of septic shock. You built a weapon out of dirt." Elara stared at him, her mind completely short-circuiting. She had tried to murder his guard. She was a liability, a dangerous prisoner. Yet, he was looking at her as if she were a marvel, as if her ruthless, desperate violence was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I won't let you cage me," she choked out, her voice raw and defiant. "No," Kaelen agreed softly. "You won't." He reached out with his free hand, carefully taking the linen scrap from her fingers and folding the lethal powder safely away. He tucked it into his own coat. Then, his gaze dropped to her ruined right leg. The swelling had doubled. The purple skin looked ready to split. Kaelen shifted his massive weight, moving closer until his knee brushed her hip. The intense, radiating heat of his body was intoxicating against the freezing chill of her fever. "Your leg is rotting, little bird." He didn't sound like Dorian when he used that name. He sounded like a promise. "The bone healed wrong. The marrow is poisoned. I have to re-break it, or you die before sunrise." Elara squeezed her eyes shut. The thought of feeling that bone snap again. "Give me permission," Kaelen whispered. He didn't grab her leg. He didn't force her down. The most dangerous alpha in the territory knelt in the dirt and waited for a broken, fever-delirious healer to give him consent. Elara stared into the pale, icy eyes of the Feral King. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Her entire life, alphas had simply taken. They took her time, her healing, her dignity, and her physical safety. No one had ever asked for her permission. Her breath shuddered past her chapped lips. She gave a single, terrified nod. "Do it." Kaelen didn't hesitate, but he didn't rush. He slowly stood, shrugging off his heavy, blood-stained leather coat. He tossed it aside and stepped onto the thick bed of furs. He sat down directly behind her, pulling her back until her spine rested completely flush against his massive chest. Elara gasped at the sudden contact. He was a raging furnace. The sheer, overwhelming heat radiating from his body seeped instantly through her damp clothes, battling the icy chill of her septic fever. He wrapped his left arm securely around her waist, anchoring her to him. "Bite down on my shoulder," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating right against her ear. "Do not swallow your tongue." She turned her face into the curve of his neck, breathing in the scent of pine, iron, and raw winter storm. She opened her mouth and pressed her teeth against the thick fabric of his tunic. Between one breath and the next, Kaelen's large right hand clamped down on her swollen thigh. His fingers locked with absolute, unyielding precision, right over the jagged calcification of the badly healed fracture. He didn't count down. He just twisted. The loud, sickening crack echoed off the damp stone walls. Elara screamed. The sound tore through her throat, muffled only by Kaelen's shoulder. A blinding explosion of white-hot agony ripped through her nervous system. Her entire body arched violently off the furs, violently rejecting the trauma. Kaelen held her. He didn't let her thrash. He absorbed the brunt of her violent convulsions, acting as an immovable, grounding wall of pure heat. His large hand remained on her leg, moving with terrifying clinical speed. He manipulated the shattered pieces of the femur, grinding them back into perfect alignment. The pain was so profound, her vision went completely black. Her lungs seized. She was falling into the dark, tumbling over the edge of septic shock. But the heat pulled her back. Kaelen's feral warmth flooded her shaking veins. He wrapped both arms around her now, burying his face in her sweat-drenched hair. He was grounding her heart rate to his own, slow, steady, unbreakable. She wasn't fighting for her life alone in the freezing snow. She was completely trapped, completely vulnerable, and for the first time in her life, perfectly safe. Her jaw went slack against his shoulder. The blinding agony began to recede into a dull, exhausted hum. She let the dark pull her under, her last conscious thought being how quiet the pain had suddenly become. The heavy, suffocating weight was gone. Elara opened her eyes slowly. The cavern was dim, lit only by the dying embers of a small fire crackling in the hearth. The suffocating pressure of the septic fever no longer crushed her chest. Her skin was cool, and her mouth tasted faintly of clean water instead of toxic ash. She shifted on the furs. Her right leg throbbed, but it wasn't the jagged, rotting agony that had haunted her for 3 weeks. It was a deep, rhythmic pulse of heavy blood flow. Healing pain, she reached down, pulling back the thick fur blanket. Her thigh was tightly wrapped in fresh, clean linen, bound securely between 2 perfectly straight wooden splints. The sickening, sour smell of dying tissue was completely gone. Without warning, a massive rush of emotion crashed into her chest. The toxic root was fully out of her system. There was no chemical numbness left to shield her. She was feeling everything. The sheer, terrifying gratitude hit her so hard, a sob ripped past her lips before she could stop it. The emotional walls she had built to survive the Vanguard crumbled into dust. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "Breathe." Elara flinched, her head snapping up. Kaelen was sitting in a heavy wooden chair near the iron grate. He was leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching her in the dim light. He looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his pale eyes, and his hands were stained with dried blood. Her blood. He had sat there guarding her while she slept. She wiped her face frantically with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "How long?" she rasped, her voice thick. 2 days, Kaelen answered softly. "The fever broke yesterday. The bone is set." Elara stared at the feral king. He had saved her life. He had treated her broken body with more reverence than the pack doctors who had sworn an oath to protect her. She didn't know what to do with the overwhelming swell of devotion blooming in her chest. As the silence stretched, Kaelen stood up. He walked slowly across the cell, stopping at the edge of the furs. He looked down at her, his expression hardening into something cold and tactical. "You owe me," he murmured. Elara didn't flinch. She sat up, ignoring the dull ache in her newly set leg. She looked up at the towering Alpha. I do. Kaelen dropped to one knee, bringing himself level with her. My pack needs the Vanguard territory. We need the winter food stores, and we need the high mountain passes to survive the freeze. But they outnumber us 3-1. He tilted his head, his dark eyes analyzing her. Tell me how to break them. The tension broke. It wasn't a threat. It was a partnership. Elara dragged herself off the furs. She ignored his outstretched hand, dropping onto the cold stone floor beside the dying fire. She brushed a thin layer of fine gray hearth ash across the flat rock. They rotate their southern patrols at moon high, Elara said, her voice ice cold. She dragged her index finger through the ash, drawing a jagged line representing the mountain ridge. There's a 15-minute blind spot when the guards switch over. That's your entry point. Kaelen leaned in closely, his broad shoulder brushing against hers. He didn't interrupt. He just watched her map the tactical weak points of the very pack she had sworn to heal. The elite guards sleep in the inner ring, she continued, marking a series of dots in the dust. But their tents are heavy canvas, treated with animal fat to repel the snow. It makes them highly flammable. She looked up, locking eyes with the rogue king. They were inches apart. The shared tactical focus was a terrifying, electric bond. I will give you the patrol routes. I will give you the blind spots, Elara whispered. But I have a condition. Kaelen's gaze dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes. Name it. When the territory falls, Elara's fingernails dug deeply into the dirt. I want Dorian. I want the Alpha's son brought to me. A low, dark rumble vibrated in Kaelen's chest. It was a terrifying sound of absolute, lethal approval. Done. Before she could draw another line in the ash, the heavy iron grate rattled wildly. A rogue scout skidded into the corridor, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with panic. Alpha! He gasped. The outer perimeter, Kaelen was on his feet in an instant, his hand flying to the hilt of his broadsword. Report. The Vanguard didn't wait, the scout choked out, pointing frantically back down the dark tunnel. The corrupt Alpha, he's marching on the caves. He brought the entire elite guard. They are hours away. The cavern erupted into a deafening symphony of ringing iron and shouted commands. There was no panic, only the terrifying, synchronized rush of an army preparing to die. Rogue wolves sprinted past the open iron grate of Elara's cell, their arms laden with heavy broadswords, iron-tipped spears, and thick leather shields. The air grew thick with the sharp scent of adrenaline and weapon oil. Elara didn't stay on the floor. She grabbed the edge of the stone hearth, hauling herself up. Her right leg hung stiffly in the heavy wooden splints, throbbing with a dull, persistent ache, but the bone held. She leaned her entire weight on her good leg. They have numbers, Elara shouted over the din, forcing Kaelen to look at her. They will push straight through the valley pass. They don't respect rogue defenses. They'll expect you to break on the first charge. Kaelen strapped a massive, scarred leather breastplate over his chest. We hold the high ground at the cavern mouth. We force a bottleneck. It won't be enough. Elara's mind raced, perfectly calculating the mass of the Vanguard forces against the narrow, icy pass. They will climb the snowbanks and drop in behind your front line. You need an environmental trap. You need the trench. Kaelen paused, his pale eyes narrowing. The perimeter trench, Elara pressed, her voice hard and completely steady. If we lace the deep snow with dried wolfsbane and nightshade, we can aerosolize it. But the wind shear at the mouth of the valley is erratic. If you place it wrong, it will blow back into the caves and kill your own men. She swallowed hard, pointing a trembling finger at her own chest. Take me to the perimeter. I have to set the jars. A rogue lieutenant stepped forward, shaking his head. Alpha, she can't even walk. Pack the herbs, Kaelen interrupted. He didn't look at his lieutenant. He kept his eyes locked entirely on Elara. He didn't coddle her. He didn't tell her it was too dangerous. Between one breath and the next, he crossed the stone floor, hooked one massive arm beneath her knees, and lifted her flush against his chest. He grabbed a heavy canvas sack filled with her harvested medical supplies. Clear the tunnel, Kaelen roared. The rogue warriors instantly parted. Elara wrapped her arms tight around his neck as he carried her out of the warm cavern and straight into the howling teeth of the blizzard. The freezing wind hit Elara like a sheet of solid ice. Kaelen dropped her gently behind the jagged ice wall of the outer defensive trench. The snow here was waist-deep, burying the lip of the cavern's natural ventilation shafts. Elara's hands were already numb, but she tore open the canvas sack, blindly pulling out heavy clay jars packed with dried, highly concentrated nightshade and wolfsbane. She mathematically measured the distance between the shafts and the wind direction, burying the jars at precise intervals along the enemy's blind spot. Then, the ground began to vibrate. It started as a low, rhythmic hum. Then it became a deafening crunch. Through the swirling whiteout of the blizzard, massive shadows materialized on the ridgeline. Hundreds of them. The Vanguard army crested the hill, their silver armor catching the faint, gray moonlight. At the very front of the terrifying formation stood two figures draped in heavy, immaculate white furs. The corrupt Alpha. And right beside him, Dorian. Elara's breath completely stopped. The air vanished from her lungs. Her heart slammed against her ribs with the erratic, terrifying flutter of a trapped bird. The sheer, overwhelming scale of her abuser's power was laid bare on the mountain. There were so many of them. The rogue line looked impossibly thin, pathetic. A sudden violent wave of irrational guilt crashed over her. She brought this war to the caves. The Vanguard used to trade Omegas and exiled healers to rival packs just to avoid a border skirmish. It was how they maintained their wealth. They traded the weak to spare the strong. Elara looked up at Kaelen. The Feral King was staring at the Vanguard army, calculating the devastating odds. Her trauma violently seized her mind. He's going to give me back. The thought was a parasitic poison. He is an alpha. He will look at the numbers, and he will trade me to save his own people. They always do. A whimper tore past her lips. She scrambled backward in the snow, dragging her splinted leg, her eyes wide with absolute, suffocating dread. Kaelen's head snapped toward her. He read the sheer terror on her face. He saw her looking at Dorian, then looking back at him. He understood exactly what her broken mind was telling her. He didn't offer empty comforts. He dropped heavily into the snow beside her and pulled a massive, jagged hunting knife from his belt. He grabbed her trembling hand and slapped the heavy hilt directly into her palm, folding her cold fingers around it. "I don't make trades," he snarled, his voice a violent, protective rumble that shook the ice. "I make graves. You hold this line." The Vanguard horns blew a single, deafening blast. The army charged. They poured down the snowy embankment like a silver avalanche. The clash of steel against steel was a physical shockwave. The rogue wolves met the charge with feral, unyielding brutality. Blood instantly sprayed across the pristine snow, painting the trench in horrifying arcs of crimson. The screams of dying men drowned out the howling blizzard. Elara crouched in the snow, her white-knuckled grip on the hunting knife shaking violently. She watched the slaughter unfold through the jagged gaps in the ice wall. Kaelen was a force of absolute destruction. He didn't fight with the practiced, arrogant flourishes of the Vanguard elite. He fought like a monster. His heavy broadsword cleaved through shields, armor, and bone with sickening ease. Every time he swung, a Vanguard warrior fell, but there were simply too many. For every man Kaelen dropped, two more stepped over the corpse to take his place. The rogue line began to buckle. The sheer numerical disadvantage was crushing them backward toward the cave entrance. Without warning, 3 heavily armored Vanguard elites flanked Kaelen. One drove the shaft of a spear directly into the back of his knee. As Kaelen staggered, the other 2 slammed their heavy iron shields into his chest, driving the Feral King violently into the blood-soaked snow. They dogpiled him, swords raised, aiming directly for the gaps in his armor. "No!" The scream ripped from Elara's throat before she even realized she was making a sound. Her heart completely stopped. The terror that spiked in her veins had absolutely nothing to do with her own survival. If Kaelen died, she would be dragged back to Dorian. But that wasn't what paralyzed her. The thought of Kaelen's heavy, protective warmth being extinguished. The thought of those pale eyes never looking at her with that obsessive awe again. It shattered her. She loved the monster. Selfless panic obliterated her fear. She threw the hunting knife aside. She couldn't fight them with a blade, but she was a healer. She knew exactly how to stop a beating heart. Elara threw herself forward onto her stomach. She dragged her splinted leg through the freezing mud and blood, crawling frantically to the very edge of the defensive trench. Her bleeding fingers found the heavy clay seals of the buried jars. She gripped the corks of the dried wolfsbane and nightshade, waiting for the wind to shift. Elara's frozen fingers clamped around the heavy clay stoppers. She didn't look at the slaughter below. She couldn't. If she focused on the blades coming down on Kaelen, she would panic, and panic meant miscalculating the wind. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the freezing gale bite into her exposed cheeks. She measured the shear, north-northeast. The updraft from the subterranean caverns was blowing outward, funneling perfectly through the natural rock shafts and directly into the deep basin of the perimeter trench. It was a flawless, deadly wind tunnel. Her body moved on instinct. Elara yanked the heavy corks from the massive jars. She didn't hesitate. She tipped the clay vessels forward, dumping piles of finely crushed nightshade and dried wolfsbane into the jagged stone vents. The grayish-purple dust tumbled down the dark chutes, instantly caught by the powerful updraft. It didn't settle on the ground. The violent wind shear whipped it into a fine, massive cloud of aerosolized particulate, perfectly suspended in the air, filling the lower trench. The very trench the Vanguard elite were currently pouring into by the hundreds. Elara let the empty jars roll away into the snow. The terrified, battered healer, who had cowered in the infirmary tent, was entirely gone. In her place crouched a cold, clinical executioner. She knew exactly what the concentrated herbs would do. She knew exactly how many seconds it would take for the lung tissue to paralyze. She had built the trap perfectly. Now, she just needed the spark. Elara dragged herself forward, leaning her chest over the icy lip of the ridge. Down in the blood-soaked snow, Kaelen roared. He surged upward with monstrous strength, throwing 2 heavy Vanguard elites entirely off his chest. He drove his armored elbow into the face of the third, shattering the man's silver visor with a sickening crunch. He didn't immediately turn to keep fighting. He didn't shout tactical orders to his lieutenants. Through the chaotic swirl of snow, blood, and flashing steel, Kaelen's pale, icy eyes snapped upward. He searched the high ridge. He found Elara. The tension broke. Even surrounded by 100 screaming enemies, the feral king stopped. He held his ground in the deep snow, his broadsword dripping crimson, and he waited. He didn't signal his archers to save him. He didn't make the call. He looked directly at the broken woman on the ridge, offering her the absolute power of life and death over her abusers. He was waiting for her command. The Vanguard forces surged forward, raising their spears to strike Kaelen's exposed back. Elara didn't blink. She locked eyes with the monster who had saved her. Her heart hammered a fierce, triumphant rhythm against her ribs. She didn't scream a warning to him. She didn't flinch. She gave a single, sharp, definitive nod. Between one breath and the next, Kaelen threw himself backward out of the deep trench, rolling onto the higher, clear snowbank. He raised his heavy broadsword high into the air and roared a single, deafening syllable. "Fire!" On the cliffs above, a dozen rogue archers loosed their taut bowstrings. Flaming arrows arced violently through the blizzard. They fell like burning stars, hissing as they sliced through the freezing night air. They struck the center of the deep trench, plunging directly into the massive, suspended cloud of weaponized dust. The aerosolized wolfsbane and nightshade ignited. It wasn't an explosion of fire. It was a massive, hollow thump that vibrated deep in Elara's teeth. A terrifying wave of dense, toxic violet smoke instantly bloomed outward, flooding the entire length of the lower trench. It swallowed the charging Vanguard elite whole. Without warning, the deafening clash of steel simply stopped. The silence that followed was visceral. It was broken only by the horrifying, wet sound of 100 men desperately gasping for empty air. The nightshade paralyzed their respiratory systems in seconds. The wolfsbane burned their eyes and throats, dropping them where they stood. Elara watched from the ridge, her breath completely steady. Below her, the pristine silver armor of the Vanguard army crashed into the mud. Elite warriors clawed at their own throats, dropping their weapons as their knees buckled. The corrupt Alpha stumbled out of the thick smoke, his face purple, his lungs completely failing. He fell face first into the bloody snow, convulsing weakly before going entirely still. the mighty, untouchable power structure of her abusers dissolved in less than 30 seconds. Not by overwhelming force or divine magic, but by the clinical application of dirt, weeds, and a healer's intellect. A savage, unadulterated rush of vindication flooded Elara's chest. She didn't look away. She memorized the sight of them falling. As the thick violet smoke began to thin, a massive silhouette moved through the dying ranks. Kaelen stalked forward. He was completely unharmed, a scrap of linen tied securely over his mouth and nose. He stepped over the gasping body of the corrupt Alpha without a second glance. His pale eyes were locked onto a single, pathetic figure crawling desperately away through the pristine snow. Dorian. The violet smoke slowly dissolved into the biting wind, leaving behind a silent graveyard of gasping, paralyzed men. Kaelen stalked through the carnage like a shadow. Dorian was frantically clawing at the steep, icy embankment, desperately trying to drag his pristine white furs away from the slaughter. "Wait!" Dorian shrieked. The smooth, arrogant purr of the Alpha's son was completely gone. It was replaced by a rapid, high-pitched whine. "My father is the Alpha. You can't." Kaelen didn't even break his stride. His massive boot came down squarely on Dorian's trailing leg. A sickening, wet snap echoed through the frozen valley. Dorian screamed. It wasn't the roar of a proud warrior. It was the pathetic, sobbing wail of a terrified coward. Elara watched from the snowy ridge above. Her pulse didn't spike. Her breathing didn't hitch. As the silence stretched, a terrifying, absolute calm settled over her chest. That was the worst part for Dorian. Her trauma was fully dragged out into the freezing light, and it was entirely pathetic. The monster who had shattered her bone, he looked so incredibly small. Between one breath and the next, Kaelen reached down. He grabbed a fistful of Dorian's blood-matted hair and effortlessly hauled him backward up the steep ridge. Dorian thrashed wildly. His freshly broken leg dragged uselessly behind him, leaving a thick, dark smear across the pristine ice. "Please," Dorian choked out, his hands clawing weakly at Kaelen's iron grip. "I'll give you gold. I'll give you the eastern borders." Kaelen ignored him. He crested the ridge and threw Dorian violently forward. The Alpha's son collapsed face first into the snow, directly at Elara's splinted leg. Dorian coughed up a splatter of crimson. He rolled over, his tear-filled eyes widening in absolute, suffocating horror as he looked up and finally recognized the broken healer he had tortured. Kaelen didn't look down at the whimpering coward. He kept his pale, icy eyes locked entirely on Elara. He stepped back, and he waited. Elara looked down at her abuser. She didn't flinch away. She didn't search for an exit. The question of her own weakness was finally answered. She wasn't weak. She was invincible. The tension broke. She gave one single, definitive nod. Kaelen lunged. He didn't use his heavy broadsword. The wet, horrific tearing sound of Dorian's throat giving way ripped through the howling blizzard. A hot, brilliant spray of crimson painted the frozen earth. Elara didn't blink as the blood of her oppressor splattered against the snow at her boots. She just breathed in the freezing air. It tasted clean. The surviving Vanguard warriors, the few scouts who had stayed back from the toxic trench, stumbled out of the swirling blizzard. They dropped their heavy swords into the mud, their eyes wide with shock as they looked up at the ridge. Kaelen stood to his full, terrifying height. He was covered in the blood of their corrupt leaders. He turned his massive frame toward the shivering, defeated survivors. "Kneel to your queen." His deep voice rumbled. It wasn't a request. It was an absolute, feral command that shook the ice. Without warning, every single remaining Vanguard warrior dropped to their knees in the snow. They bowed their heads to the lethal healer they had spent years ignoring. Kaelen stepped close. He pulled a thick, heavy fur mantle from his own shoulders and wrapped it tightly around Elara. The immense weight of his blazing body heat instantly enveloped her, smelling of sharp pine and absolute safety. He leaned down, pressing his lips firmly, reverently, against her cold temple. Her body moved on instinct. She let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned her entire weight against his massive chest. "I never want to go back to standing alone." The thought was quiet, unbreakable. She looked out over the kneeling army, fully held by the monster who had simply let her fight. Her right leg didn't hurt at all.